The moment he signed that letter, I flashed back to the night he left me at the hospital alone. The December wind howled through downtown Detroit as I watched my former partner Detective James Rodriguez sign his retirement papers at the precinct's front desk. 27 years of service, countless investigations solved, and a reputation that commanded respect from every officer in the department. But as his pen moved across that official document, all I could think about was that terrible night 8 months ago when he abandoned me in the hospital hallway, choosing his career over our friendship when I needed him most. The fluorescent lights in the police station cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floors, and the familiar sounds of radio chatter and ringing phones created a backdrop that had defined our professional lives for over 2 decades. We had started as rookies together, worked our way up through the ranks, and built a partnership that seemed unbreakable until that one moment of betrayal that shattered everything I thought I knew about loyalty and brotherhood in law enforcement. If this story is resonating with you, please take a moment to comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we genuinely help families and individuals going through these challenging situations. Your support means everything as we continue sharing these real stories of overcoming adversity and finding strength in the darkest moments. What James didn't know as he completed his paperwork and prepared to walk away from his badge and gun was that I had been carrying a secret for the past 3 weeks that would change everything between us. Hidden in my locker was a thick manila envelope containing evidence that could destroy his reputation and pension, documents that proved he had been involved in activities that violated every oath we had sworn to uphold when we first joined the Detroit Police Department fresh out of the academy. My name is Detective Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I had considered James Rodriguez more than just a partner. He was the brother I never had, the person I trusted with my life during dangerous situations, and the man who had helped me navigate the challenges of being a female officer in a male-dominated profession. We had shared countless late nights on stakeouts, celebrated successful investigations, and supported each other through personal struggles that came with the demanding nature of police work. The betrayal had occurred during what should have been a routine evening shift last April. We had been investigating a series of armed robberies targeting convenience stores in the east side of Detroit, a case that had consumed our attention for several weeks as we tried to identify patterns and gather evidence that would lead us to the perpetrators. The investigation had been progressing steadily, and we were confident that an arrest was imminent based on witness descriptions and surveillance footage we had collected. That particular night, we received a call about a domestic disturbance at a house in the Corktown neighborhood, an area known for its mix of young professionals and longtime residents who had weathered decades of Detroit's economic challenges. Domestic calls were among the most dangerous and unpredictable situations that police officers faced, with emotions running high and the potential for violence escalating rapidly once law enforcement arrived on the scene. When we arrived at the address, we could hear shouting coming from inside a small 2-story house with peeling paint and a neglected front yard that reflected the economic struggles facing many Detroit families. James and I followed standard protocol, positioning ourselves on either side of the front door while calling out to announce our presence and request that the occupants come outside to speak with us about the disturbance that neighbors had reported. The situation escalated quickly when a man in his 30s burst through the front door wielding a baseball bat and screaming incoherently about his girlfriend and various grievances that seemed to involve both personal relationships and work-related stress. His eyes were bloodshot and his movements erratic, suggesting that alcohol or drugs might be contributing to his aggressive behavior and making him unpredictable and dangerous to everyone present. I attempted to de-escalate the situation using verbal techniques we had been trained to employ, speaking calmly and trying to establish rapport while keeping a safe distance and maintaining awareness of potential escape routes if the confrontation turned violent. James positioned himself slightly behind me, ready to provide backup if needed while also scanning the area for other potential threats or witnesses who might require protection. The man with the baseball bat became increasingly agitated as our conversation continued, and despite my efforts to calm him down and convince him to drop his weapon, he suddenly lunged toward me with clear intent to cause serious bodily harm. I managed to dodge his initial swing, but lost my footing on the uneven concrete steps and fell backward, striking my head against the iron railing that bordered the small front porch. The impact was severe enough to cause immediate disorientation and bleeding, and I could feel warm liquid running down the back of my neck as I struggled to maintain consciousness and assess the continued threat posed by our suspect. Through the fog of my head injury, I could hear James shouting commands and the sound of our police radio crackling with urgent communications as backup units were dispatched to our location. What happened next would haunt me for months to come and ultimately destroy the trust that had been the foundation of our partnership. Instead of immediately calling for medical assistance or staying with me to ensure my safety while backup arrived, James pursued the suspect who had fled on foot into the maze of streets and alleys that characterized the neighborhood. He made a split-second decision to prioritize apprehending the perpetrator over caring for his injured partner. I lay on that cold concrete porch for nearly 15 minutes, drifting in and out of consciousness while waiting for paramedics to arrive and provide medical attention for what would later be diagnosed as a severe concussion and cervical strain that would require weeks of recovery time. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing that my partner had abandoned me in my moment of greatest vulnerability. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics were professional and efficient, but they expressed concern about the delay in receiving medical attention for what was clearly a serious head injury that could have resulted in permanent damage or death if complications had developed. They carefully immobilized my neck and spine before transporting me to Detroit Receiving Hospital, where I would spend the next 8 hours undergoing various tests and evaluations. James eventually arrived at the hospital around 3 in the morning, after successfully apprehending the suspect and completing the paperwork associated with the arrest. He seemed proud of his police work and appeared surprised by my cool reception when he entered my hospital room, expecting congratulations and gratitude for solving the case and ensuring that our attacker would face criminal charges for assault on a police officer. The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental difference in our priorities and values. James explained that he had made a tactical decision to pursue the suspect while I was down because he feared the man might escape and potentially harm other innocent people if he wasn't captured immediately. He argued that calling for backup and medical assistance was sufficient to ensure my safety while he fulfilled his duty to protect the community. I tried to explain that partnership meant never leaving your partner behind, especially when they were injured and vulnerable, regardless of other considerations or potential consequences. The foundation of police work was supposed to be mutual support and protection, with officers looking out for each other because they understood that their survival often depended on having someone they could trust completely watching their back. The argument continued for nearly an hour, with neither of us willing to concede our position or acknowledge the validity of the other's perspective. James maintained that he had acted appropriately given the circumstances, and that my criticism was unfair given the successful outcome of the incident. I insisted that his priorities were fundamentally wrong and that he had violated the most basic principles of partnership and loyalty. The physical recovery from my injuries took 6 weeks, during which time I was placed on medical leave and required to attend regular appointments with neurologists and physical therapists to monitor my progress and ensure that no permanent damage had occurred. The emotional recovery proved much more challenging, as I struggled to process the feeling of abandonment and betrayal that accompanied my partner's decision to prioritize the arrest over my well-being. During my time away from work, I had plenty of opportunity to reflect on our partnership and the incidents over the years that I had previously dismissed or rationalized but now saw in a different light. I began to recognize patterns of behavior that suggested James had always been more concerned with his own advancement and recognition than with the welfare of his colleagues or the communities we served. When I returned to active duty, the dynamic between James and me had changed irrevocably. We maintained professional courtesy and continued to work effectively together on investigations, but the easy camaraderie and implicit trust that had characterized our relationship for 15 years was gone. I found myself constantly second-guessing his decisions and preparing for the possibility that he might abandon me again if faced with a similar choice. The breaking point came 3 months later during a routine investigation into allegations of corruption involving several officers from our precinct. Internal Affairs had received anonymous tips suggesting that some detectives were accepting bribes from drug dealers in exchange for providing advance warning about planned raids and investigations. The accusations were serious enough to warrant a thorough investigation that would examine financial records, communications, and operational procedures. As part of the internal investigation, all detectives were required to submit detailed financial disclosure statements accounting for any income or assets that might appear inconsistent with police salaries. We were also subjected to polygraph examinations and extensive interviews designed to identify any involvement in corrupt activities or knowledge of colleagues who might be compromising their integrity for financial gain. During my interview with Internal Affairs investigators, I was shown copies of bank deposits and expenditures that had been traced to James's personal accounts over the previous 2 years. The amounts were significant enough to raise questions about their source, particularly given that they occurred around the same times as several high-profile drug investigations that had resulted in surprisingly light sentences or dismissed charges for defendants who should have faced serious prison time. The evidence presented to me was circumstantial but troubling, suggesting that James might have been involved in the corruption scheme that was being investigated. The investigators asked if I had noticed any changes in his behavior, lifestyle, or financial circumstances that might corroborate their suspicions. They also wanted to know if he had ever made comments or suggestions that indicated knowledge of or involvement in corrupt activities. I was faced with an impossible choice: protect my partner despite the evidence against him, or cooperate with the investigation that could end his career and destroy his family's financial security. The decision was made even more difficult by the fact that James had 3 children and a wife who depended on his income and pension benefits for their future well-being. Destroying his career would have consequences that extended far beyond just punishing him for his alleged crimes. Over the next several weeks, I conducted my own informal investigation, carefully observing James's behavior and looking for additional evidence that might either confirm or refute the allegations being made against him. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I had anticipated, including evidence of regular meetings with known criminals and financial transactions that clearly indicated ongoing corrupt relationships. The final piece of evidence came when I accidentally discovered text messages on James's phone during a routine investigation when he asked me to check something while he was driving. The messages contained explicit discussions of payoffs, warnings about upcoming raids, and coordination of activities designed to protect drug dealers from prosecution. There was no longer any doubt about his guilt or the extent of his involvement in the corruption scheme. I made the decision to compile all the evidence I had gathered and present it to internal affairs investigators, knowing that doing so would effectively end James's career and probably result in criminal charges being filed against him. The betrayal I had felt after being abandoned at the hospital was nothing compared to the devastation of discovering that my partner had been systematically violating his oath and compromising investigations for personal financial gain. The evidence I provided was sufficient to support criminal charges against James and several other officers involved in the corruption scheme. Search warrants were executed at their homes and offices, resulting in the seizure of additional evidence including cash, documents, and electronic communications that confirmed the scope and duration of their illegal activities. The scandal made headlines in Detroit newspapers and resulted in a comprehensive review of procedures and oversight within the police department. James was arrested at his home 3 days after I provided the evidence to internal affairs. The charges included bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violations of federal racketeering statutes that could result in decades in prison if he was convicted. The arrest was particularly humiliating because it occurred in front of his neighbors and family members, ensuring that his disgrace would be public and permanent. The trial lasted 4 months and received extensive media coverage as prosecutors detailed the elaborate scheme that had allowed drug dealers to operate with impunity in exchange for regular payments to corrupt police officers. James's financial records were examined in detail, revealing that he had received over $200,000 in bribes over the course of 3 years, money that had been used to purchase luxury items and finance a lifestyle far beyond what his police salary could support. During the trial, I was called as a prosecution witness to testify about my investigation and the evidence I had gathered against James. The experience was emotionally devastating as I was forced to detail the corruption of someone I had once trusted and respected, but I knew that my testimony was necessary to ensure justice and protect the integrity of the police department and the community we had sworn to serve. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against James and his co-conspirators. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison and ordered restitution of all money received through corrupt activities. His pension and benefits were forfeited, leaving his family without the financial security they had counted on for their future well-being. As James was led away in handcuffs after his sentencing, he turned to look at me one final time with an expression of anger and betrayal that suggested he blamed me for his downfall rather than accepting responsibility for his own criminal choices. That look confirmed that he had learned nothing from the experience and still didn't understand that his actions had violated everything we were supposed to represent as police officers. 6 months later, I received notification that James was being released early from prison due to overcrowding and good behavior, with the remainder of his sentence to be served under house arrest with electronic monitoring. The news brought back all the emotions I had worked to process during the time since his conviction, including anger about the injustice of his reduced punishment and concern about what he might do once he was free. Which brings me to this morning, watching him sign his retirement papers 8 months after being released from prison. The department had been forced to officially terminate his employment following his conviction, but bureaucratic procedures required formal retirement documentation to finalize his separation and eliminate any possibility of future claims against his pension or benefits. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was signing papers to retire from a career he had already destroyed through his own corrupt choices. As James completed the paperwork and prepared to leave the precinct for the final time, he approached me with what appeared to be an attempt at reconciliation or explanation. His appearance had changed dramatically during his time in prison and house arrest. He looked older, thinner, and carried himself with the defeated posture of someone who had lost everything that once defined his identity and purpose. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I know you'll probably never forgive me for what I did, but I want you to know that I understand why you had to turn me in. I was wrong, and I destroyed everything that mattered to me because I got greedy and stupid. I just hope someday you can remember the good times we had before I screwed everything up." I looked at this man who had once been closer to me than my own family and felt a complex mixture of emotions including sadness, anger, and a small amount of pity for what he had become. The James Rodriguez who had been my partner for 15 years was gone, replaced by a broken person who would spend the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of choices that had hurt not only himself but everyone who had trusted and depended on him. "James," I replied, "the hardest part wasn't turning you in for being corrupt. The hardest part was realizing that the person I trusted with my life for 15 years was willing to abandon me when I needed help the most. The corruption was just confirmation of what I learned that night at the hospital, that you were never really my partner in the way that mattered most." He nodded sadly and walked away without another word, carrying his box of personal belongings out the front door of the Detroit Police Department for the last time. I watched him disappear into the crowd of people on the sidewalk, just another anonymous figure trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by poor choices and moral failures. 2 hours later, I was cleaning out my locker when I found the manila envelope containing copies of all the evidence I had gathered during my investigation into James's corruption. I had kept these documents as insurance, unsure whether they might be needed for appeals or additional legal proceedings. Looking at them now, they represented both the end of a friendship and the beginning of my understanding about the true meaning of integrity and loyalty in law enforcement. That evening, I drove to the Detroit River and stood on the riverbank watching the sunset reflect off the water while I processed everything that had happened over the past year. The betrayal, the investigation, the trial, and now James's final departure from the police department had been a journey that taught me painful lessons about trust, friendship, and the importance of doing what's right, even when it's difficult and personally costly. I thought about the night he left me bleeding on that hospital porch and realized that it had been a defining moment that revealed his true character and priorities. Everything that followed, the corruption, the lies, the destruction of his career and family, had been inevitable consequences of a person who was willing to put his own interests ahead of his responsibilities to his partner, his community, and his profession. The manila envelope in my hands contained more than just evidence of financial crimes. It documented the complete moral failure of someone I had once admired and trusted. As I tore the documents into small pieces and let them fall into the dark water of the Detroit River, I felt a sense of closure and resolution that had been elusive during the months of legal proceedings and emotional turmoil. James Rodriguez was now officially retired from the Detroit Police Department, but his legacy would be the destruction he had caused and the trust he had betrayed. The moment he signed those retirement papers, I had flashed back to that terrible night when he chose his career over our partnership, not realizing that his choices would eventually destroy both his career and every relationship that had ever mattered to him. My career in law enforcement continues, and I've been assigned a new partner who understands the importance of loyalty and mutual support that James never truly grasped. We work well together because we share a commitment to integrity and service that goes beyond personal advancement or financial gain. The lessons I learned from James's betrayal have made me a better police officer and a more discerning judge of character. 3 years have passed since that December morning when James signed his retirement papers and walked out of my life forever. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that he struggled to find steady employment and that his family continues to deal with the financial and social consequences of his criminal conviction. Part of me feels sorry for them, but I also know that consequences are an important part of justice and accountability. The Detroit Police Department has implemented new oversight procedures and ethics training programs designed to prevent the kind of corruption that James and his associates engaged in for years without detection. These reforms are necessary but can't undo the damage that was caused to the department's reputation and the community's trust in law enforcement. Rebuilding that trust requires officers who understand that integrity isn't negotiable and that our primary loyalty must always be to the people we serve. Sometimes I still think about that night when James left me at the hospital and wonder if things might have been different if I had confronted him immediately about his priorities and values. But I've come to understand that his corruption wasn't a sudden decision but rather the culmination of years of small compromises and moral failures that eventually led to complete ethical collapse. The moment he signed that retirement letter marked the end of a career that could have been distinguished by service and dedication but was instead defined by betrayal and corruption. As I watched him walk away from the precinct that final time, I knew that justice had been served even though the personal cost had been enormous for everyone involved. Today, I serve as a training officer for new recruits joining the Detroit Police Department, sharing my experience and emphasizing the importance of integrity, loyalty, and ethical decision-making in law enforcement. I tell them about the night my partner left me bleeding and alone, and how that moment of abandonment was actually a preview of much worse betrayals to come. The story of James Rodriguez serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing personal gain over professional responsibility and the importance of holding ourselves and our colleagues accountable to the highest standards of conduct. His retirement papers represented not just the end of his career, but the completion of a moral journey that began with abandoning his partner and ended with abandoning everything he had sworn to protect and serve. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment below and let us know where you are watching from, as well as your thoughts on loyalty and betrayal in professional relationships. Every perspective matters, because stories like these remind us that while partnerships may face challenges, struggles, and even devastating betrayals, there is always an opportunity for learning, growth, and the development of stronger ethical foundations. When you engage, whether it's through commenting, liking, or subscribing, you are helping us build a space where professionals can feel less alone and more supported in facing difficult ethical decisions. Many people silently carry the burden of discovering corruption or betrayal among colleagues, and often just hearing that someone else understands can provide enormous relief and validation. Your support allows us to continue creating and sharing content that examines these complex moral situations and provides insight into the real challenges that law enforcement officers and other professionals face when confronted with ethical dilemmas. We believe that even in the most difficult circumstances, there are lessons to be learned and strength to be found in doing what's right regardless of the personal cost. So please, if this message resonates with you, don't hesitate to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you're not just supporting us, you're standing with professionals around the world who struggle with questions of loyalty, integrity, and moral responsibility in their daily work. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for helping us continue to share these important stories of ethical courage and professional accountability.